Hi, welcome to Stories of Art. My name is Carel Huydecoper. Today I want to tell you the story of Icarus. It's of course that famous story about a boy who had wings made of feathers and wax, and he flew too closely to the sun and then he died. But there's more to the story than that, and it has been painted and sculpted throughout history, and our perception of that story has changed somewhat over the ages. So I'll show you a number of paintings, and in those you will see that we have started to look at this story differently. But what is the actual story? What's the myth? Well, it starts with his father, Daedalus. He was an architect and inventor in Athens, in ancient Athens. And he was busy building and inventing stuff when he came across his nephew, Perdix. And Perdix was a very talented young man, and he actually invented the saw to cut through wood, that sort of a saw, and a compass, a measuring compass. And Daedalus was so jealous of that he killed his nephew. And that's why he had to leave Athens. And he ended up in Crete. Now in Crete there was King Minos. And King Minos, he had Daedalus, he employed Daedalus to make all kinds of things for him. One of the famous things he made was a large bronze bull. And that bull was big enough to hold a man. So he would, what Minos would do, he would put his enemies inside the bull and then light a fire underneath. So it was a torture instrument. There was a lot to do with bulls in Crete. Actually, King Minos's either mother or grandmother was called Europa. And she had at one point fallen in love with a bull. That bull happened to be Zeus, but still fell in love with a bull. King Minos was sort of a descendant of that bull. At some other point he had received a bull from Poseidon, and the idea was that he had to sacrifice that particular bull to Poseidon, but he had found it too beautiful to kill. Then instead of killing it, he let it roam free, but then his wife Pasiphaë actually fell in love with it and wanted to mate with her. She couldn't, so she employed Daedalus, who approached the whole thing as a, let's say, mechanical difficulty. So he built a cow that Pasiphaë could crawl into, and then the bull would mate with the cow. So you could say that perhaps this family overall was maybe a bit overly fascinated with the whole cow thing. Anyway, Pasiphaë then had a child, and that child was half man, half bull. That's the Minotaur. And for that, Daedalus had to make a holding place, a place where that Minotaur could live. And for that he made a labyrinth. The famous labyrinth of Crete was made to hold the Minotaur. Daedalus built that, and it was a place where you would get lost and you would get tired, and so the Minotaur would then eat you. For some reason it could only eat humans, so it had quite a different sort of palate than most bulls, I suppose. But there was a trick to getting out of the labyrinth, and that was that the labyrinth had a very distinct length. And so Daedalus gave Pasiphaë a length of string that was exactly as long as the entire labyrinth. And if you went in and you would unwind that string, you would be able to find your way back. And also find your way around the labyrinth, because you could see where you had been and where you hadn't. That's the whole thing, I guess. But the very fact that there was a secret to this labyrinth meant that King Minos then locked Daedalus up in a tower, because he couldn't be allowed to leave the island. Just to be sure, Minos had every ship that tried to leave Crete searched, so there was really no way off the island for Daedalus. And, by the way, his son Icarus. But Daedalus knew he couldn't flee by sea, so he decided to flee by air. And that's why he started making wings out of feathers and wax. He made two pairs, one for his son Icarus and one for himself. He tied these wings to, well, his son and to himself, and there's several paintings of that where you can see him doing that. Here's one by Lord Leighton, and there is of course another one, this one by Anthonie van Dyck, where you can actually see Daedalus speaking to Icarus, and he's telling him a very important thing about flight, and that is you mustn't fly too low, because if you fly too close to the waves of the sea, the spray will get into your wings and they become too heavy, and then you crash and you'll drown. But you can also not get too high, because if you get too high, you get too close to the sun, your wings will heat up, the wax will melt, and you will fall down into the sea and again drown. That is, if the crash doesn't kill you. And that's the essence of the story. You cannot fly too low, you cannot fly too high. You had to take the middle road, the golden route as he called it. And then they simply took off, and these wings worked. So they flew a very long way. They actually passed Delos, and that's, 150 kilometers to the north, I think? A long way. And that's when Icarus started to forget the advice of his father, and he started to fly too low, or he flew too high, and he started to frolic around. He started to play around in the air. He was overconfident, and then he got too high, and he got too close to the sun. The wax in his wings melted, and he fell to the sea, and he died. Daedalus then came down as well, recovered his body, and named the island where he buried him Icaria, after his son, and it was even called the Sea of Icarus, the sea around it. Daedalus then just took off, and he ended up in Sicily, where he, well, lived out his life. So the whole idea of the wings actually worked very, very well. Now, in Greek and Roman times, this story was a story about taking the middle road, not going too high and not going too low. But in medieval times, that is in Christian times, the story started to be seen in a very different light. And that different light is that of one of the deadly sins, the deadly sin of hubris. Some would say pride, but in some cases it was regarded that hubris is the mother of all the 7 deadly sins. And the whole idea of Icarus flying too high became an example of hubris. And of course in the Bible there are several proverbs that tell us that hubris comes before the fall, like the one of, "The Lord detests the proud, they will surely be punished," or "Pride goes before destruction, the haughty spirit before a fall." So in the Middle Ages, Icarus was seen as a sinful, a bad character. And even in the early modern age, the Renaissance and later, he was very often seen as a character used to warn people about hubris. For instance, this rather strange picture by Hendrik Goltzius. It's a series of 4 engravings of the 4 disgraces. 4 examples of the sin of hubris, of reaching to the gods. It's the fall of Icarus, the fall of Phaeton, of Ixion, and of Tantalus. Now, all these 4 were examples not to follow, and this is the one of Icarus falling down. So he's actually a disgrace here. But a slightly older one by Pieter Brueghel the Elder shows us a warning against hubris in general. Here we have this landscape. There's a farmer here working hard. He's looking down at his field that he's plowing, so he's doing something useful and down to earth. Slightly further on we see a shepherd working with his sheep, but he's looking up, not looking at his sheep. He's distracted by something. And in the distance we see the actual warning. There's a ship there. And Pieter Brueghel often worked in Antwerp for rich ship owners. And these rich ship owners apparently felt they needed to be reminded of the dangers of hubris. Because of course if you send out a ship and send it out to somewhere too far, or your captain doesn't heed the dangers of the sea, or thinks he's stronger than the forces of nature, I suppose at the time they would have said the forces of God, then your ship will surely sink. And we're reminded of that by the figure that's right next to that ship, and that is the falling Icarus. This painting, by the way, has been copied a lot. First and foremost by Pieter Brueghel's sons, and they sold a lot of copies of these. And not just by their own hand. In their workshop they made dozens of copies by assistants, and very often they included Daedalus in the sky, and very often you can see the shepherd looking up and actually looking at Daedalus in the sky. For instance, in this anonymous copy made in the late 16th century. But then, in the 19th century, we really started to look at these things differently. In the 19th century, Icarus was transformed into a sort of a romantic figure. A hero that, instead of getting too close to the sun, was reaching for the stars. And there's a big difference between the two. We started to see him as a romantic ideal of someone reaching for greatness and dying while trying. And that's how you got paintings like this one by Herbert James Draper. This is called the Lament of Icarus. And it's symptomatic for this different approach to the story of Icarus, because here Icarus has fallen, but we don't see him as a sinful figure. He is a hero, lamented by different nymphs who crowd around him and see this quite magnificent body, of course. By the way, Draper made a very stark contrast in their skin colors. That is, his nymphs are very, very white, and he is much more tanned. Not really just that tanned, he's burnt, because he was too close to the sun. That's the idea. But he has these huge and beautiful wings, which were based on a bird of paradise, apparently. But this beautiful, muscular, young body that has been broken is here lamented. And of course, in the same sort of period, Oscar Wilde would write, "Never regret thy fall, O Icarus of the fearless flight, for the greatest tragedy of them all is never to feel the burning light." So a completely different way of looking at things. Now, this painting by Draper you can see in the Tate Gallery in London. But before you go there, you might consider giving me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, and if you really enjoyed this video, you might even consider to subscribe to this channel, because there's a lot more where this came from. In any case, I'd like to thank you very much for watching, and see you again soon. Bye.